Something just happened at the highest court in the United States that most people haven't fully understood yet. It didn't come with dramatic headlines for days. It didn't dominate the evening news the way some rulings do. But quietly, inside a Supreme Court decision about firearms and constitutional rights, there's a legal shift that could change something incredibly common in America. Traffic stops. Yes, the simple moment when flashing red and blue lights appear behind your car and you pull over to the side of the road. That everyday interaction between police officers and drivers may never be interpreted quite the same way again. But before we break down what changed and why it matters, I want to ask you something directly. If you were pulled over by police during a routine traffic stop, would you feel comfortable knowing the officer might assume you could legally be carrying a firearm? Or do you think that possibility makes those encounters more dangerous for everyone involved? Take a second and think about that. Then tell me your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how people see this because it reveals a lot about how we think about rights, safety, and trust between citizens and law enforcement. Once you've shared your thoughts, stick with me because what the Supreme Court just did could quietly reshape how officers approach millions of traffic stops every year. To understand this change, we need to start with something fundamental. For decades, courts in the United States have struggled with the same balancing act: how to respect constitutional rights while also allowing police officers to keep themselves and the public safe during unpredictable encounters. Traffic stops are one of the most common interactions between citizens and police. In fact, millions happen every single year across the country. Some are simple: a speeding ticket, a broken taillight, maybe a warning. Others become more complicated. Officers sometimes discover outstanding warrants, illegal weapons, impaired drivers, or other crimes during those stops. Because of that unpredictability, courts have historically given officers certain powers during traffic stops. They can ask drivers questions, they can check identification, they can run license plates through databases, but when it comes to searching a person or their vehicle, the law is more restrictive. Under the Fourth Amendment, police generally need probable cause or consent to conduct a search. However, there has always been an important exception. If an officer reasonably believes a person may be armed and dangerous, they are allowed to conduct what's known as a protective frisk. This is a limited pat-down search meant to ensure the officer's safety. That standard has been shaped by decades of court decisions, and for a long time, the logic was fairly straightforward. If an officer had specific reasons to believe someone might be armed and pose a threat, a protective search could be justified. But what happens when carrying a firearm becomes more common and more widely protected under constitutional law? That's where the Supreme Court's recent reasoning becomes extremely important. In its ruling expanding protections for carrying firearms in public for self-defense, the court emphasized that law-abiding citizens have a constitutional right to carry weapons outside the home. This means something very significant in practical terms. If carrying a firearm in public is a protected constitutional right, then the mere possibility that someone is armed cannot automatically be treated as suspicious behavior. Think about that for a moment. For years, in some places, simply suspecting someone might have a gun could raise concerns about illegal activity. But when the law recognizes that many ordinary citizens may legally carry firearms, that assumption changes. Now imagine how that affects traffic stops. An officer pulling over a vehicle may reasonably assume that the driver could be legally armed. In fact, in some states with high rates of concealed carry permits or constitutional carry laws, that assumption might be statistically likely, but the key question becomes this: does the possibility that someone is armed automatically justify a search? This is where legal debates are already beginning to unfold. Some legal scholars argue that if carrying a firearm is legal, then being armed should not by itself justify a frisk or search during a traffic stop. Others argue that officer safety still requires the ability to check for weapons when circumstances make officers feel threatened. The Supreme Court's emphasis on the right to carry firearms is now forcing courts to rethink how those two ideas interact, and that's why some experts are calling this a hidden impact of the ruling. Because while the case itself itself focused on public carry laws, the logic behind the decision reaches into everyday police encounters. Now let's talk about how traffic stops actually work in the real world. When an officer pulls a vehicle over, the situation is often uncertain. The officer doesn't know who the driver is. They don't know if the person has a criminal record, outstanding warrants, or a weapon. Officers are trained to approach these encounters carefully because traffic stops can become dangerous very quickly. At the same time, the law places limits on what officers can do without justification. They can't search your car simply because they feel like it. They can't pat you down without a reason tied to safety concerns. The legal system tries to balance those competing realities. But when firearm carry rights expand, the assumptions officers rely on may need to adjust. Imagine a state where thousands or even millions of citizens are legally allowed to carry concealed firearms. An officer pulls over a driver for speeding. The driver is calm, cooperative, and follows instructions. But the officer knows that in this state, many people legally carry guns. Is that knowledge alone enough to justify a frisk? Some courts have previously suggested that the answer could be yes under certain circumstances. But the Supreme Court's recent emphasis on firearm rights complicates that logic. If the Constitution protects the right of ordinary citizens to carry firearms, then being armed cannot automatically make someone suspicious. This is the tension courts are now grappling with. And it's not just a theoretical issue. Traffic stops happen constantly in America, every day, in every state. Even a small shift in legal interpretation can affect millions of encounters between police and citizens. Another factor that comes into play is something known as duty to inform laws. Some states require individuals who are carrying firearms to inform police officers during a traffic stop. Other states do not have this requirement. In states with duty to inform laws, drivers must tell the officer that they are carrying a firearm, usually as soon as the officer approaches the vehicle. Failing to do so can sometimes lead to legal penalties. In states without such laws, drivers are not obligated to disclose that information unless asked. These differences already create confusion for people who travel between states. Now add the evolving legal interpretations of the Supreme Court's ruling, and the situation becomes even more complex. Imagine a driver traveling across multiple states on a road trip. In one state, they are required to inform the officer they are carrying. In another state, they are not required. In yet another state, their permit may not even be recognized. During a routine traffic stop, misunderstanding those rules could lead to serious problems. This is why legal experts often emphasize that knowing the laws of the states you travel through is extremely important if you carry a firearm. Another issue that may emerge from the Supreme Court's reasoning involves how courts define reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion is a legal standard that allows officers to investigate possible criminal activity when specific facts suggest something illegal may be happening. But if carrying a firearm is widely legal, the presence of a firearm cannot automatically create reasonable suspicion. That means officers may need additional factors before conducting certain searches. Some judges may interpret the Supreme Court's reasoning as reinforcing that principle. Others may emphasize officer safety concerns and allow broader discretion during traffic stops. Because of these different perspectives, the issue is likely to appear in future court cases. Lower courts will eventually need to clarify how the right to carry firearms interacts with search and seizure rules during traffic stops. Until those cases are decided, the legal boundaries may remain somewhat uncertain. And uncertainty in the law often leads to disagreements in real-world encounters. This is why understanding your rights and responsibilities is so important. If you are pulled over during a traffic stop, remaining calm and cooperative is usually the safest approach. Follow the officer's instructions, keep your hands visible, avoid sudden movements. If you are carrying a firearm, know the laws in your state regarding disclosure. If the law requires you to inform the officer, do so clearly and calmly. If the law does not require disclosure, you still need to follow follow any lawful instructions given by the officer. Remember that roadside encounters are not the place to debate constitutional law. If a legal issue arises, courts are the place where those disputes are resolved. The Supreme Court's ruling has strengthened the recognition of the right to carry firearms in public for self-defense. But as with many constitutional decisions, its real-world effects will unfold gradually. Traffic stops may be one of the areas where those effects become most visible. Officers will continue adapting their training and procedures. Courts will continue interpreting how constitutional rights apply in everyday situations. And citizens will continue navigating the complex intersection of rights, responsibilities, and public safety. Which brings us back to the question I asked earlier. If you were pulled over during a routine traffic stop, how would you feel knowing the officer might assume you could legally be carrying a firearm? Does that make the situation feel safer because responsible citizens have the right to defend themselves? Or does it make the situation feel more uncertain for everyone involved? There's no simple answer, and that's why this conversation is so important. Because sometimes the biggest impact of a Supreme Court decision isn't the headline everyone sees. Sometimes it's the quiet shift in how everyday interactions between citizens and government are interpreted. And when it comes to traffic stops, that shift could affect millions of Americans every single year. So I want to hear your perspective. Do you think this legal change will make encounters between police and citizens safer or more complicated? Share your thoughts in the comments because the discussion surrounding gun rights, police powers, and constitutional protections is far from over.